Hi everyone, and welcome to the Motorsport Medicine and Rescue Mastery podcast, a podcast where we take deep dives on the elements of high-performance medical and rescue response at motorsport events. We trade practices, pull apart the evidence for what we do, talk with guests, and share experience for a variety of motorsport categories. And we want you to get involved in the conversation as well, so send in your comments, questions, and practices. Right, let's get on with the podcast. Hello everyone, Matthew McPartland here for the Motorsport Medicine and Rescue Mastery podcast. COVID-19 has kept us off the real-world racetracks for a while, but slowly governments and health advisories are easing up on restrictions. So we should see some level of returning to race activity happening, and it already is in some places. So we thought we would explore the challenges and barriers to this, and brought in some friends to help us out for a global perspective. Remember, we want to hear your opinions, so jump onto the Roll Cage Medic website and the page that goes with this podcast and tell us your side. And as always, wash your hands, stay home if you can, get to hospital if you're unwell, and look after each other. Hello everybody, and welcome to the Motorsport Medicine and Rescue Mastery podcast. Today we are going to have a chat about a topic that's on everybody's minds, lips, eyes, newspapers, media. It's coronavirus. And particularly, we're going to have a look at coronavirus and how it has affected motorsport, and how we might be looking at getting motorsport back on track, given that a lot of physical restrictions, social distancing restrictions, are being lifted in various parts of the world to greater or lesser success, depending on how you measure that. So around the table, we've got the usual cast. We've got Jamie, Tressa, and Greg up there on the panel. We might be able to release this as a video, but if not, I'll just let you know who's around the table that I can see anyway. But we've also got two guests. We've got Rickard Johansson, who's joined us previously from Sweden. Hi, Rickard. How's it going?
Just fine. A little bit cold, but the summer is soon coming.
Excellent. Well, yes, because you're all up in the northern hemisphere. I'm the only one down here in the southern hemisphere. So we're heading into our winter, and no doubt it'll be freezing down here, probably a really frigid around about 13, 14 degrees. So we'll have to put on extra layers.
I had snow today, so
Yes,
that's the comparison.
Yeah. I suspect you've got proper cold. And the other guest we have today is Ben Shippey, who's over there in the UK. Hiya, Ben. How's it going?
It's good, thank you. We haven't had snow. It's good to join you. Thank you very much for asking me to come and join the panel. That's good.
No problem. Lovely to have you along. And Ben, maybe because you haven't been on the podcast before, maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you fit into motorsport.
Yeah, for sure. So my day job is neuroanesthesia and critical care medicine, and I do that in Dundee in Scotland. I've been involved in motorsport. Well, the story goes I've been involved in motorsport because my dad was at Silverstone the day my mother went into labour. I don't know whether that's a true story or not, but it's a good one, so I'm sticking to it. So I've been in motorsport since I was born. I've been around Silverstone since the mid-90s, British Grand Prix, WEC World Rallycross, and I'm Chief Medical Officer for Wales Rally GB. But if it's there and it's got an engine, then I'll go.
Fair enough. I think we all share that passion. So what I thought we might do is have a quick look at what coronavirus is doing in various people's parts of the world. So Ben, seeing as you're online at the moment and on main camera, we might get you to sort of give us a quick summary of what coronavirus has been up to in the UK, sort of in general, how it's hit the health system, what your numbers are doing, and then we can move on to motorsport in a little while.
So I haven't got, I should have looked, shouldn't I, before I started, before I came online with you at the numbers. But in terms of overall deaths from COVID-19 in the UK, we are not doing well. We are certainly into the 30s of thousands, and we may just today have tipped into the 40,000s of deaths in the UK. The vast majority of those have been in the elderly, and the vast majority of those have been south of the border. As I said to you, I work in Scotland, and we've been privileged in Scotland, I think, to an extent by the fact that the virus has spread north, and the country shut down when cases started to peak in London, when we had relatively few. And I think we've been protected in the north to a degree by social isolation. So while we've had a lot of cases up here, and we've had a lot of ICU admissions up here, we haven't been swamped perhaps in the way that other healthcare environments in the UK have, and we have managed to deal with the cases that we have had within a moderately expanded resource. What seems to have happened over the last couple of weeks is that the number of infections has fallen, the number of admissions to hospital has fallen almost to nothing, and I haven't taken an intensive care referral for COVID-19 pneumonitis for over 10 days now. Most of our patients have either sadly died or have recovered and gone back out of critical care into the general ward. So at the moment for us, we're in a situation of calm and control, waiting for the brakes to come off social intervention, and then we'll see what happens again.
Fair enough. So that sounds pretty rough. I mean, where you're saying where you are, you haven't been massively tested, but certainly the rest of the UK has. So, you know, that's a hard thing to come out of.
Yeah.
Acknowledging all of that, are there sort of one or two key learnings that have come out of practice in the UK in terms of managing coronavirus from an acute care perspective? That's
really interesting. And it'd be interesting to hear the opinions of other people around the panel. I think when we went into this at the very beginning, and we're going back now 5-6 weeks perhaps, our expectation was that we would see a lot of people with a pneumonitic ARDS type disease. And actually what we've seen is something which is so far from ARDS that it is not ARDS at all. What we're seeing is a multi-system disease which is dominated by coagulopathy and microemboli. We're seeing an awful lot of renal failure, which is not recovering in the way that acute tubular necrosis does in the patients that we normally see with multi-organ dysfunction. So this is a multi-system disease in which hypoxemia is a feature, but it's certainly not pneumonitis in the way that we would expect a viral pneumonitis ARDS type picture. This is far more like a vascular disease of the lung with multi-system involvement and coagulopathy playing a big part in the pathology. At least that's our opinion, and it'd be really interesting to hear the other guys around the panel to see what their opinion is of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, indeed, and we might just do that now. Rickard, if we can move across to you, what's coronavirus been doing in Sweden? Because I'm aware that Sweden's a bit of an outlier from the rest of the Nordic countries.
Yeah, I think we have taken a different route to the rest of the world. In fact, we haven't taken the route with quarantine and with isolation in the same way. We closed down the nursing homes, we closed down some of the hospitals, but otherwise society is almost open. We have the university and the higher learnings are closed and they have distance learning, but all other schools and preschools are open and working in a regular mode. So instead we can see that we have had a lot of deceased throughout the last few weeks, and I don't think everyone is quite satisfied with the way they have decided to do it, but I think the only way to see if it was the right way is in the future. So, But this means that we don't have the problem that the other countries have, that now has opened up their quarantines and restrictions, and now are seeing an increased number of patients into the intensive care that we don't see. We have had the high numbers already, and it's almost come to a level where it has played out. And right now the hospitals are seeing lesser of ICU patients, and instead we are seeing patients that can be treated quite easy and be sent home quite soon. So the only problem we've had is with the elderly. We can see quite obvious that it's the elderly people that has taken the hit, and as well as we can see a higher number with the immigrants in comparison to the regular Swedes. So that is what we have learned here in Sweden.
Fair enough. So we might move across the pond a little bit over to North America, where depending on where the person you were talking to lives, it seems to have been fairly patchy. Some places really badly hit, some places maybe not so much. So maybe Jamie, we might start with you, given that you're based in New York. What coronavirus has been doing over there? Because we've certainly heard a lot about it on the media.
Yeah, I mean, New York as a state, has been badly hit. I mean, there's just under 1.5 million cases in America, and 350,000 of them are in New York. The interesting thing is that there's a very clear difference between downstate New York, which is where New York City is, with Manhattan and Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn, and upstate. And upstate's behaving like the rest of the country. Very patchy, spotty, sporadic case numbers, with a little bit more consolidation in the cities, and in the rural areas really not that much going on. So some hospitals just haven't seen any cases of coronavirus. And then if you take a little trip to New York City, you're going to find wards and wards full of them. What's interesting though is it's an illness that we've probably been sitting with for quite a while. And back in November, we were seeing cases of flu-like illness that we were testing people for the flu, swearing that they had the flu. And then they were testing negative for influenza. We were sending them home. And I suspect some of those cases were COVID. We've gone through an interesting kind of trend. Initially, we were seeing a lot of hypoxemia. These guys were coming in quickly to the hospital. They had shitty SATs, and they wanted them all put on ventilators because they didn't want to aerosolize it with BiPAP and CPAP machines. And so everyone got thrown on ventilators, and they kind of sat on ventilators, just hypoxic, and that was it. They were managed. And then we ran out of ventilators, and then the BiPAP units that we were not using, we suddenly decided to use, and people actually did better, which I love, because, I mean, in Scotland, I always love to tell the story that when I worked in Edinburgh, we had 12 ICU beds for a hospital for a major city. And, you know, if you have the same size hospital in America, you'd have 200 ICU beds. So there's a lot more non-invasive management done in Europe. And so we kind of switched from intubate everyone to intubate no one. And then it kind of died down. We thought we were getting under control. And then all of a sudden we started seeing these young people coming in with strokes and embolic phenomenon and coagulopathies and DIC. And so then we kind of went through phase 2, which was all the vascular stuff. And then we went through a phase of the kids are resistant to it. No kids are getting it. And now we're actually in a phase of all the kids are getting it. And they now have this weird Kawasaki's disease. So, I mean, it's interesting because I think there's so many people watching these trends, and trying to draw conclusions very quickly. But it really is a dynamic situation. I mean, personally, I think that the biggest change to my practice is that I got to wear a mask all the time, and I got to wear PPE. And if you have a cold, you're not allowed to have a cold in America anymore. You get brought in, isolated, get put into some form of negative pressure room, and you know, you may just have a cold, but it is really tiring wearing this PPE for 12-hour shifts. It's just exhausting, changing it constantly, and I think the fatigue of working inside spacesuits has just been kind of a big hit. And then I think emotionally, I think that everyone's just stressed the hell out because they don't know what's going on yet. And so, you know, as I said, I was in the wine shop recently, and I was pushing my cart, which was somewhat fuller than normal. And someone was walking by me and they sneezed, and it was like someone shouted terrorist and bomb, because all of a sudden there's like people are literally abandoning their carts and running out the shop. And then all of a sudden these two people show up in bunny suits and start scrubbing down the wine bottles. It was, you know, and you know, I've decided now that speeding is a really good thing in America now, because if you get stopped by the police, all you got to do is cough on your license before you hand it to the cop, and he'll run a mile. He just won't give you a ticket. So it has been an interesting experience in New York for sure.
Wow, I can't even begin to compete with that. Certainly here we've heard some pretty horrendous numbers around New York, but it is interesting to hear how patchy it actually is. And that thing of the different phases of the initial hypoxias, and then the younger people with coagulopathic issues and strokes and renal failure, and now the kids. Is there much talk? I mean, there's little that I can sort of add here, because we just haven't been challenged by this in Australia really of it to any great degree. So is there much talk or agreement on what this actually represents? Is it phases of illness? Is it mutations? Is it something else? And maybe Ben, you might want to come in on this as well.
The honest answer is I don't know. I would echo 100% Jamie's thoughts about throwing everybody on a ventilator and then 3 weeks later realizing actually that ventilation is not the answer to this disease. I think that the first people that I went to see with this disease, I was staggered by how well they looked in the face of such appalling oxygenation. And I've sat and looked at people who look entirely comfortable and are cerebrating, and talking to me who have SATs in the mid-70s, and the overwhelming instinct of an intensivist is to throw a tube down them and stick them on a ventilator. But it's not the answer, and I think we were probably sold a bit of a dummy at the beginning when everybody told us that CPAP and BiPAP didn't work, and what we needed to do was ventilate everybody. The more we've thought about it and the more we've done of it, the more we realize actually that if you ventilate everybody, what you end up with is a bunch of people that are stuck after 3 and 4 and 5 weeks on a high oxygen percentage, who aren't making any progress, who have renal failure, and then they start to have strokes and they have pulmonary emboli. And this is a disease of the vasculature, I think, rather than the lung. And that's borne out perhaps in what we're starting to see now in the younger people with thrombotic disease. And it may be the case that what we're starting to see in children with this vasculitic type disease that we're starting to see. But nobody knows, and I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy that's trying to deal with the consequences of what comes through the door. There are far cleverer people than me, but this is not a lung disease. This is a multi-system disease, and it's about endothelium, I think, more than anything else. I don't know. Other people will say.
So then presumably what you're no, that's okay. I was just waiting to see if anybody else was going to jump in, or whether Jamie was going to come in on that again. And because we're transnational, there's always these long pauses.
Well, I always, you know, it's kind of interesting how we've kind of developed a group of physicians that react to a number over what's in front of us. And, you know, when I was climbing a couple of years ago in South America, we were up at 20,000 feet, and our saturations were 52, 55, 60%. And we were sitting, you know, round the tent, you know, chatting to each other. And yeah, we felt short of breath, and we felt a little uncomfortable, and it took a while to walk from A to B, but we were still able to function mentally. And I mean, I think it's brought home that, you know, you don't have to be 98% saturated and 99% saturated. You can do okay. And actually, the longer you're at 70% and 60%, the more your body adapts to it. And, you know, it's very different in the States compared to the European medicine, but, you know, we would rarely, in the emergency room in Britain, we would rarely do blood tests that made any difference. We would do everything clinically. And then I came over to the States, and I had to interpret blood tests that I'd never even heard of before. So, I mean, the people in front, I would say, I'd agree with Ben, the people that I've seen, you would swear that, I mean, I've had people that I would send home, and then I see the numbers and I say, oh boy, I can't send that person home. But they want to go home. And you say, no, you can't. You're too sick. At least I feel great. So it is interesting how it's almost like we're living through the pathophysiology of the disease as it's progressing through the community.
So we probably need to move on. There's one question I have, but I will get input from anybody else if they want to just throw in here before we move on. But you were talking about it's been brought up before where people have compared this illness to high altitude sickness. And you were just talking there about low oxygen saturations, and eventually you accommodate, and some of that is due to an increase in your hemoglobin. So your carrying capacity just gets better. Is that potentially related to any of the increased clotting that we've seen, that there's just a higher hemoglobin and more sludging in the blood, or is it a, like Ben was saying, an endothelial problem that's setting off the clotting cascade?
So the only thing that we've noticed that perhaps sheds a bit of light on that is that the oxyhemoglobin saturation curve, PO2 SpO2 relationship, is left shifted. So we're seeing staggeringly low PaO2s for the saturation. So something's happening to hemoglobin. I don't know what it is, but there's a left shift in that curve.
Right. So it's not that the hemoglobin is numerically changing; it's qualitatively changing.
I think it's qualitatively changing, but this is Ben Shippey for communication on the phone on the 15th of May or whenever it is. There's no evidence behind that; it's observation.
Yeah, fair enough.
And the PO2 SpO2 relationship is not the same as we would expect.
Ben, clearly you're a proper intensivist and Matthew isn't, because you've been on this podcast for half an hour and managed to bring in the oxyhemoglobin curve. And he has been failed to do that in like 10 episodes of this podcast.
Yeah.
That's fair. I'll take that. That's fair. I resign. Ben, you're running this show from now on. Congratulations.
I tried very hard to hide the fact that I'm a bit of a nerd.
I think we all are.
Okay.
We need to move on now, away from character assassinations and ego bumping, and we'll move on to where this is going to from motorsport. So maybe Greg, we might get your input on this one. Where's motorsport up to where you are? Is there any actually happening? And then we can talk about how it might get back on track.
Right. So I had a conversation. I work for World Challenge, and that's the only motorsport. Formula E was canceled for Brooklyn. Le Mans is moved to September, but Corvette, this will be the first year in, I don't know, 20 years that they're not going. And this was their big year too, because I think it was their 20th anniversary. You know, I had a number of, I made it to, so doing motorsports, I made it to the end of February and then things started getting canceled. So IndyCar Coda was canceled, and then Formula E was canceled, Le Mans was moved, and now I think Le Mans is going to go off, perhaps, but there's the issue of teams having money issues because a lot of the financial system is not good in the Western world and the racing world. So we'll see how many teams show up to Le Mans. But World Challenge, which is an SRO group, so Stefan Rotel's organization, is trying to open at Virginia International Raceway early July, I think July 11th. And so we're trying to figure out how, you know, no fans allowed. It's only going to be teams, eight people per team with the driver and then our staff. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to monitor and do the same thing, because I work at a university and we're also trying to figure out the same thing of how we're going to open. And so monitoring, taking temperatures, you know, what do you do with someone who gets sick? So we're trying to work an action plan. I just debuted or reviewed a system that it almost looks like a small Apple iPad that takes a temperature and does facial recognition, and you know, you log in, so it logs the person that's being screened and sends it up to the cloud, their temperature, and it will send the person that's monitoring, and it'll send them a text message if they find somebody who's high, who has a high temperature, and it can also integrate a daily questionnaire. And I think questionnaires may be a better screening tool for illness. So between the questionnaire and taking the temp, we hope to catch anybody who's sick. But that's about it. We're going to see how this goes off, you know, and see if everybody can be comfortable with the screening that we're going to do, because we have to screen everybody. And as you all know, in motorsports, a lot of the people, especially the tech people and some of the flaggers, I mean, they're retired people, and because they love motorsports, they go out and do it. So it's an age. Number one, they're older. A lot of them have comorbidities, and that's a big risk. And so we're essentially going to tell people that if you've got cardiovascular disease, if you've got pulmonary disease, if you're, you know, on some type of, or had chemo at some point, or actively on, you know, any immunocompromising something, just stay home. You know, we'll find somebody else to do it, because we don't need to put you at risk. And we're doing the same thing at the college, you know, for people that are on the campus cleaning. We have, I think, 500 students who essentially have nowhere else to go, because you know, that's their home. The residence hall is their home, so they've let them stay on campus. We have to keep open the dining hall, the dorm, and the cleaning people that are there, and the people that are working. Have been screened out for, if you've got comorbidities, you stay home.
Yeah, so we'll get to some of the measures that we might need to be putting into place in a moment. Tressa, just getting over to you there in California, what kind of motorsports is currently active, and are there discussions actively happening about getting motorsport back on track? Pun intended.
Yeah. I think with regards to the West Coast, especially Nevada and California, and they've been very, very cautious, and they have not done anything with regards to getting motorsport back on track quite yet. I think that has to do with our governor, who we actually end up going on quarantine March 19th, so fairly early in the process of this. And I think over the next couple of weeks, depending on how what the numbers do, that may determine whether motorsport will open up in the next month or so. But they've been very, very cautious, and I can tell you nothing has been running, at least in California or Nevada.
Okay. And are there at least discussions happening as to how it might look?
I think there are discussions how it look. Definitely it's going to be without spectators. It's just going to be the teams pretty much running them. And they are going to limit the number of people with the teams that come in, and have a specific monitoring process when they enter and when they leave, and just checkpoints throughout the day. But definitely it's going to be very people that are going to be able to come in with the team, and it's going to be a lot. Every team shows up.
Yeah, fair enough. Ricard, if I can bring you in, I think I saw recently on one of your posts that motorsport is up and running to some degree over in Sweden.
Yeah, that's correct. We closed down all the spectator side. The bigger events are all closed down. We have a limitation of 50 spectators. We have some of the racing that is still running, and they lean on the fact that they are run by companies and it's not a public event, and then they can do it, but without spectators. So we have some of the series that keeps running with strict rules. Otherwise, it's only track days, and tomorrow I'm loading up to go for 2 days of test and tune in drag racing. So we've done about 10 events, but all the big public events are moved, and they're looking on restarting in the middle of July. And some of the series are already now aiming to restart in the middle of August. That will be a very compressed season, because our season ends in about halfway into October. So it will be quite a crammed season, and the big problem we are having right now is that the borders are closed. The borders to Norway are closed until 15th of August. The border to Denmark are closed. So even though we want to run, we can't get the participants to go from one country to another, because it's not it's a leisure travel. It's just for fun. So they are not allowed to pass the border. So that's the situation right now.
And so how high up are the categories of motorsport? Is it clubs, multi-clubs, and all the way up to national, or is there a limit as to
No.
how high up it goes?
It's right now. It's closed track days, and the smaller events are running the training sessions, but no racing. The only racing I know that is being done right now is a time attack series with very strict regulations. That's the only one that's running right now in the entire Nordic area. And if we're looking in Europe, we can see it's the same thing. The problem is that the teams can't get permission to travel between the countries, and that's the problem with us here in Europe, is that we are many countries in a small area, and that means that all these borders are closed. So that's becomes the great issue to solve right now. And I know that a lot of the series are pushing the calendar towards the autumn, towards the end of the summer, but we will come to a point where I think a lot of the bigger series just will cancel entire seasons.
Right. Wow. Yeah, we've got I suppose, similar border issues here in Australia, in that even though Australia is one big country, it's got states and territories, and there are several state borders that are currently closed. So, as I said earlier on, Australia really hasn't been tested in the same way that the rest of the world has with COVID. I think in total we've had something like around 7,000 cases across the entire country. We've had just under 100 deaths across the entire country. And half of both of those numbers are in New South Wales, where I am, with the rest of it spread out. We've had a very low case incidence in the last probably 10 days to 2 weeks now, but it's not quite gone away. It just seems to be hovering at a low rate. Our ICUs were significantly ramped up to take patients. EDs were restructured, entire hospitals were repurposed. And then we've all sort of sat back waiting for the tidal wave that didn't really come. Now that's probably due to the fact that we went into not quite full lockdown, but we certainly had a lot of restrictions placed on us, and we just had a much longer lead-in time than anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. So we seem to have benefited from that. What's uncertain though is that we're now heading into our winter down here. Flu certainly doesn't seem to be as active, given that we've all been distanced. But as a result of all of that, a couple of things have happened in sport, and certainly, I don't know how much Australian media you get up there, but our rugby leagues certainly caused a bit of a stir in trying to push their agenda to get back onto the field, and a few of them got into trouble for a few things. Breaching potential restriction regulations or requirements. But sport has started to look at getting back on, and that's resulted in the Australian Institute for Sport, which really represents a lot of the Olympic level sports where Australia is represented on a national level. They put out a framework for rebooting sport. That's actually the title of it. And they put out a whole load of guidelines on what sport should or could look like, and divided it into level A, which is effectively full lockdown and people just training on their own, maybe engaging with a personal trainer using a video conferencing platform. Level B then is more complete training, where you're allowed groups of up to 10 people, but still doing your best to maintain physical distancing. So for a team sport, say something like basketball or netball, you could train as a team, but you were training passing and shooting. You weren't necessarily getting in and close. And then level C is full training and full competition, but with coronavirus still in the environment, and so still trying to minimize the potential for transmission. So a lot of people have looked at level C and thought, oh, that's us back to normal. It's not quite back to normal. It's with all of the requirements of minimizing transmission. And so with the AIS publishing that, a lot of other sports have, they'd already been doing some work, but they use that as a trigger to push forward their agenda. And so Motorsport has certainly made representation to the government for various levels of motorsport. And some states are now open, probably along the line of level B guidelines. And a lot of what you were talking about, Ricard, and Greg and Tressa, is certainly limiting numbers, no spectators, putting things in place to try and minimize people grouping together. And we'll go into some of that in a little bit of time. Ben, what's happening with motorsport in the UK at the moment? Is there any at all? Is there discussions about how it's going to get started?
So that's two questions, and I guess the answer is no and yes, but you want a bit more than that. The Motorsport Association, which is our licensing body in the UK, made a decision fairly early on that it wasn't going to issue any permits for motorsport to take place in the UK. And this is four-wheeled motorsport to take place in the UK until the 30th of June. So there will be no four-wheeled motorsport in the UK until the 30th of June.
And that's not open for negotiation. That's a fixed thing.
No, there will be no permit there'll be no license to run your event from the MSA until then, and that'll be reviewed. And that really maps well to government regulations at the moment. which is all getting slightly complicated now as the devolved nations, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, start to do slightly different things to what is happening in England, perhaps in a way that mirrors what's happening in Australia, with different states perhaps doing slightly different things. But we will see in Scotland no relaxation of our very stringent lockdown restrictions until the end of May. And I would suspect that there'll be only very gentle relaxation of those rules through June. So the chances of us running anything really over the summer, I think in Scotland are very small. The questions that we have at the moment are whether we can run the British Grand Prix in the middle of July. And there is certainly talk of running 2 British Grand Prix, either over the same weekend or consecutive weekends. That's not confirmed, but that would be certainly behind closed doors with no crowds in the way that you are talking about in other places. The British Rally Championship is on hold. The first event of that may run is Ypres in Belgium, actually, which is a slightly peculiar round of the British Rally Championship that happens in the continent. British Touring Car Championship is suspended until the end of what would normally be our summer break, and we're talking about trying to compress the rounds of that into a truncated season, which would run into the autumn. But the answer at the moment is nobody really knows what is going to happen. We're starting to plan Wales Rally GB for October. But even now, we are far from certain that that is going to happen. So we are waiting really until the summer to see if anything does happen, but far from certain that it will.
So that must be a significant challenge. I mean, putting together a world championship, never mind 2 world championships, is a pretty heavy undertaking and requires months worth of work and planning. And even for an event that is held in roughly the same place, so you've got certain things that just roll over from the previous year. But even then, there's quite a lot of work. So to know that you're potentially going to go back to motorsport maybe at the end of June and have very short time to actually get things up and have to balance out, well, what if it all gets cancelled? There's only so much we can book because this event may not actually go ahead. How's that panning out?
Yeah, so the instructions that I have from the organisers at the moment, the promoters at the moment, is book as much as you can, but don't spend any money.
Right, great advice. Fantastic advice.
So that's where we are. So we're using stuff for Wales Rally GB that we've done before. The route is currently embargoed, but we're not doing anything that we haven't done before. So we can, to a certain extent, take stuff off the shelf and do it again, because we can't go and recce. That's not allowed. So we've got to do stuff that we've used before.
All right.
So we'll see. Guys are
looking
volunteering to come. They're booking their leave, and we're hopeful, but who knows?
Who knows? Yeah, no, we're looking at maybe kicking off motorsport calendars properly this coming week. Certainly, club and multi-club events are being wound up, assuming that the government goes ahead and gives Motorsport Australia the exemptions that it's looking for. The restriction at the moment will certainly be interstate travel. That's going to be very difficult to get past. But even at that, there's an exemption being looked for the professional tiers of motorsport. So particularly something like supercars, which is at the top level. Presumably other high-end categories as well, like GT Australia and Porsche Carrera and a few others will be looking for similar exemptions to be able to do interstate competition. But by no means is any of that guaranteed, and we'll probably hear something about that this coming week. Jamie, do you want to come in here? Because again, you've got Formula E and a couple of other things in your background. What sort of discussions are being had to get those kind of things back on track?
You mean me or Greg? You want me?
I want you, Jamie. I always want you.
I thought I was in anesthesia purgatory after that last comment I made about you. So, I think that I'm not sure how it's like around the rest of the world, but it would seem to me in the States, there's a significant fear component attached to COVID. And so, logistically on many levels, this makes holding a motorsports event very difficult, even down to the point that I was just advised that IMSA, which was running a race up in Watkins Glen, just moved it to October. But even in October, you're going to ask me to sit in a car with 6 other people that I've never met before for an endurance race, for a 6-hour endurance race in a 4-day weekend. And people are already asking the question about how am I going to be safe sitting in that car? So I think that it's okay losing the crowds. I think that it's a problem because you may start to lose the sponsors, which I think is a huge business thing, because businesses have been wrecked in America. And so it would not surprise me if some of those large sponsors start cutting back their budgets over the next 2 to 3 years as results start to come out. But even at a basic level, sure, there's some guys out there that like to dress up in a loincloth and run on a track and say they're protected, and act like Hercules. But there's a bunch of people out there that just don't want to be around other people. And, these are the people that are going to be the flaggers, the rescue guys, the firefighters, the track services guys. And then it's complicated even further in America because the government is making fairly generous unemployment payments. And these guys were generally minimum paid workers, and they actually are making more money being on unemployment than they're ever going to make working at a track. So there's a huge logistical problem moving people into the position to hold one of these races. I still haven't made up my mind how I'm going to protect myself in that environment, and what's safe and what's not. It is interesting because over the last several years, there's been a lot of discussion about respiratory precautions at motorsport events. And we've all been talking about, we've gone from pulling a bandana over our face before we fire the purple K at the fire to making sure that you're upwind when you do it. But then we've started to move more towards these toxic chemical releases from the vehicles. And, there's even talk about various forms of self-contained breathing apparatus and filters. So it could potentially be that this COVID crisis that we're in may actually precipitate more aggressive respiratory precautions and more aggressive PPE on track as well, because people just don't want to be around it. It's a high-risk environment because you're pulling people from all over the country to one area for 4 days. And even the smallest road races have a phenomenal amount of logistical support that comes with them. And then, of course, a lot of these guys are flying in. They're going through other major connecting airports. There's a lot of risk for exposure. So it's going to be interesting to see how it progresses. I think that logistically just holding races is going to be tricky. And, what we've seen in the States is NASCAR started up their season again, but they're holding it in smaller tracks behind closed doors with no crowd and limited teams as well. So they're on the track, but these are small tracks that they're racing at, and they're in states that maybe have far more relaxed quarantine laws, and also in states that NASCAR has a significant influence in, or the motorsport industry is a significant contributor to the local economy. So I think all these things are kind of floating around. I don't know if I've got any answers yet. I certainly think that right now, I don't think I want to be in a crowd with 100,000 other people watching cars racing around, sitting in a chase vehicle with 4 or 5 people that have come from all over the country, and not really knowing what I'm being exposed to or not. So,
yeah, I think that's what makes this podcast particularly interesting, the fact that we've got people from all over the world, because in Australia, we've got a very low prevalence of disease. We've essentially got cluster transmission, not community transmission. So essentially what that means is that the majority, if not all of the cases, have an identifiable source, usually related to epidemiology or a known contact with a COVID person. But our incident rate is very, very low. And so that's led us to feel relatively secure, and it's part of what's behind the government deciding, okay, it's time to ease up on restrictions, and again with sports climbing onto the back of that and saying, okay, well, let's see what kind of limited way we can get going in. And I think when you look at a lot of the guidelines that have been put out, so between the AIS framework and now the Motorsport Australia return to race document, which I'll put links to both of those resources up for anybody who wants to have a look at them. But a lot of it is risk mitigation in a low prevalence cohort of people. And I think some of our practices are slightly different at motorsport tracks as well, in that our intervention vehicles, I mean, when we recorded the podcast on what is an intervention vehicle, I thought we'd be lucky to get 10 minutes out of that. We ended up talking for about nearly an hour, I think, because of the differences in practice. So our intervention vehicles will generally have 2 people in them, maybe 3 on a rally. Whereas over there in North America, you guys routinely talk about having your trucks with 4 to 6 people in them. So for our return to race guidelines, the one of the lines in is that operational vehicles, i.e. things like MIVs, fire rescue trucks, those kind of things, recovery trucks, would have no more than 2 people in them. That's presumably not going to work for you guys unless you completely restructure how you deliver your motorsport response. I'm looking at you nodding, Jamie.
well, you told me to mute my thing, so I think you get plenty of no if we're going to ask you a question, which is good. Yeah, I think that in the States we're just used to bigger responses, and with more equipment on scene and larger teams, and it comes from a whole multitude of reasons, not the least the malpractice and liability aspect of motorsport, and people's level of caution and expectation as well. But you're absolutely right. There's 2 options here. They restructure how they run motorsport response, or they just don't hold races. And I think in New York, with such a large prevalence of disease in downstate New York, even though the track is in upstate New York, I think you're going to find people not really wanting to come to New York for an extended period of time, or connect through a New York airport to get up here. So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption. But I think that across America, you're going to see a general increase in the caution that people are showing towards each other, and I mean, I think there will be some significant changes. I'm not convinced that motorsport is going to come back as quickly as some of the other sports. I mean, I think that tennis matches are probably going to be pretty quick. Golf is going to be pretty quick. I think that soccer and American football and baseball is going to take a little bit longer. But I think that these large venue type races are really, they're going to be different for a long, long period of time. And then there's going to be a whole big financial concern about whether it's going to be viable running these things. Motorsport in the States is sponsor driven and advertising driven. And I just feel that people's mindset has changed completely towards life. And, I think there's a lot of people asking, do I really need to spend $600, $700, $800 on a weekend ticket to go and see a car race. A lot of people can't afford it anymore, and I think it's gonna change how things go, and different tours have different vibes. So I think IMSA is very much driven by the car companies and the technology and the prototypes, whereas NASCAR is very much driven by the fan base and celebrity and weekends. And so I think different series are going to see very different maturing, I think would be the best way. But I still, as I say, I'm not so sure I want to be sitting in the car in upstate New York, knowing that I'm there with a bunch of firefighters from downstate New York. And then the other interesting thing, Matthew, is that what we've seen is right now in New York, the antibody prevalence is about 15%, which is pretty high. But when you look at the prevalence downstate, it's closer to 40%. And when you look at the prevalence in EMS providers, it's also at about 40%. So they may actually just wait and see how this thing plays out, let COVID burn out a little bit, and then see what resistance we have in the community before they even make any big commitment to any large-scale events.
Yeah, fair enough. I think, again, that's why this is interesting. You know, we've got a low prevalence country here in Australia, and so we're keen to charge ahead. But looking at somewhere like, you know, New York, other places, you know, Ben over there in the UK where the prevalence is high, and you just assume that everybody has COVID. Presumably, the approach is different as a result of that.
And I mean, maybe Greg can chime in as well. But New Jersey is right beside New York, and it has a huge COVID exposure just now as well. It's probably hotter than New York City right now. So I don't know what he feels about this stuff.
Yeah, a couple of points. You know, our series, the World Challenge, we don't rely on fans. You know, they sell tickets, but it's all, the money is driven by the people that the teams that show up, and there are a lot of gentlemen drivers with very deep pockets. So fans and advertising isn't that important. So it's not going to be a loss if we don't have fans at our races. They're also extending the race weekend a couple of days longer, so that instead of, we might do a double race, and we've got I think at least 5 different series that race with us. And so they're going to have, in order to make up for the races lost, so that the competitors get the number of races that they want, they're going from 2 races a weekend to 3 races a weekend. So they're extending it at least 1 day. The other thing, you talk about NASCAR in my recollection is so risk averse. And so I'm really surprised that they are going racing. Now NASCAR has always been one to go for the sensational. And so if they're the first sporting event in the United States, I mean, people are just so antsy to see anything sports related. They're watching replays of baseball games and hockey games from, you know, 10, 20 years ago. And people just want to watch something. I guess there was a ping pong table tournament that everybody was watching. So they're really hungry for sports. But one of the things that the financial people have been talking about is, what's the liability issue? If you force someone to come back to work, or you say, well, we're gonna open our plant, and if you don't, you're being offered work, and if you don't come, then you don't get unemployment anymore, or we're not going to support you through our funding that the government gave us, because now you have the opportunity to work. So I'm surprised that NASCAR is opening, because they don't want anything that opens them up to liability. And I think this does, because what if if they bring 200 officials to Darlington this weekend, and 20 of them get sick, and God forbid that one of them dies. What's that liability going to be like for them? And the companies in the United States are asking for the waiver of the liability, whereas the workers are saying, why should we waive your liability? We're gonna come and work and make money for you. Why shouldn't you be liable? You're making money off of us. So it just seems odd that NASCAR is going for it in that manner.
Yeah, there's some really tough questions to try and answer. We've been looking at mostly the clinical side of things and PPE, but I think that's a huge thing is the liability, the finances, the drop off of sponsors. Rickard, over there in Sweden, is this the kind of stuff that's being bandied around as well? Have you had to have a look at what sponsors might be doing? Has it forced you to have a look at how you provide your service in terms of number of people in a truck, or how you're deployed?
Absolutely. One of the big issues has been, does the team have the budget to run the entire season? So a lot of the series has reduced calendar, and for us it's the same. We are most often 2 guys in the truck. At some events we're going to be 4, but as we've been talking about, we're going to reduce that and move the medical staff and split them between 2 trucks, so we are 3 in each truck instead of 4. But the thing that we notice is that we have been more serviceable to the tracks, because a lot of the tracks has unfortunately had to send home staff, so they don't have the guys that usually runs the race control, that usually does the cleanup, the recovery and stuff like that. So we have been covering more of that. So for our sake, we have more bookings right now for the tracks, for track days and stuff like that. They usually run by themselves. So I believe that we need to find solutions on how to manage these problems in a different way. It's the same problem for everyone, and we need to help each other and find a good solution out on the tracks. But definitely it's going to be a situation. We've been talking about the problems with the medical staff, that we don't know if we are going to get the medical staff to the track, because as it has been right now, if a region gets a big increase in patients, then it's not certain that the doctors and nurses can come to the track. And that can change from one day to another. And as well, if we get an accident out on the track, are we the ones that are going to take a place in the ICU with the injured driver when they need that place for the COVID patients? So there are a lot of discussions about these topics right now. If we're going to run, we might try to run in regions where we have a low number of COVID patients. So right now we have 3 regions that are almost maxed out right now. They are doing extra hospitals. They have used the military hospitals to take care of all the patients, and they built tent hospitals outside the regular hospitals. But in almost all the other parts, we are on a level where it doesn't matter if you get an injured driver for that hospital. So that is some of the topics that's been thrown around here. And right now we're in a situation where the National Federation, Athletic Federation, are not allowing races, but some of the series runs outside the National Federation and runs under different insurance. They are able to do racing. So it's a little bit of an ethical discussion here as well.
All right, so there's clearly a lot more in this than I was anticipating. I had thought that we might get a review of coronavirus in everybody's areas and the discussions that are happening in terms of motorsports. I thought we might get that covered in sort of 20 minutes. And here we are an hour later, still going through detail with probably a lot more to pick apart, certainly than I had anticipated. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this again, getting on the podcast and contributing your knowledge and experience from the different parts of the world. I think it's been really useful to hear how this has affected different parts of the world, both outside of motorsport and within motorsport. And I think we've got a lot more to discuss about this. It's clearly a very complicated area, particularly depending on whether you're in a low prevalence area or a high prevalence area, and what the various pushes to get sport back on track are in your area. So we might take a break here and come back and reconvene and do a part 2 for this. Okay, that's probably enough for today. There is a lot more to explore, so watch out for the next podcast on motorsport and COVID-19, when we'll take a look at some of the aspects of a motorsport event that may need some changes in order to minimise the risk the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus presents. Remember to jump onto the Roll Cage Medic website for links and resources mentioned in this podcast, and to leave a comment. And you can also get us on Twitter and Instagram using @RollCageMedic, and on Facebook. Until next time, wash your hands, stay at home if you can, and take care.
The views or opinions presented on this podcast are solely those of the person stating them and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of any of the agencies or institutions that person may work at or with. Information presented on this podcast does not imply a therapeutic relationship, nor does it imply medical advice. Anyone needing a medical opinion should seek the advice of a family practitioner or local emergency department. Every effort is being made to ensure that the information presented on this podcast is up to date and in line with current best practice. However, regional variation and evolution of practice over time may result in changes, and the listener is advised to be aware of their local practices.